Hello, everyone. Tonight, we're going to Milwaukee, Wisconsin to step inside an apartment that looked just like any other back in the summer of 1991. It had cream-colored walls, a humming refrigerator, and the faint smell of chemical cleaner. But what police officers discovered there would become one of the most shocking crime scenes in American history. A murder mystery has occurred, though mystery isn't even strong enough of a word. It's more like a nightmare wearing the mask of normal life. Behind those closed doors, a young man named Jeffrey Dahmer was hiding something unspeakable: body parts, trophies, photographs, and a story that would force the world to confront the darkest parts of human psychology. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if you really like what I'm doing here. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from. I've always thought it would be fascinating if two listeners found out they live on the same street. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let's get moving tonight. The year was 1991. Milwaukee wasn't known as a dangerous city at the time. It was more about breweries, working-class neighborhoods, and Midwestern politeness. But in a nondescript apartment block at 924 North 25th Street, the silence held secrets. Neighbors had whispered for months about odd smells coming from apartment 213. Some thought it was spoiled meat. Others joked, maybe he's a taxidermist who doesn't know what he's doing. But nobody really pressed. Jeffrey Dahmer. The tenant seemed quiet, a little awkward, but nothing more than that. That night in July, though, things changed forever. A man named Tracy Edwards bolted down the street in handcuffs, flagging down two patrol officers. He claimed that Dahmer had tried to kill him, that there were strange things in that apartment. The police followed him back, skeptical at first. Milwaukee police officers were used to odd calls, drunk fights, domestic arguments. But this was different. When they stepped into apartment 213, the first thing they noticed was the smell. Thick, sour, almost sweet in a grotesque way. They saw a bedroom with photographs scattered around, Polaroids of dismembered bodies. In the refrigerator, a human head. In the freezer, packages wrapped in brown paper labeled like leftovers, but inside were hearts and muscles. The silence of the building broke open into a collective scream as news spread. Jeffrey Dahmer, the shy blonde guy upstairs who said hello in the hallways, wasn't just a loner. He was something else entirely. And here's a chilling historical fact to frame this. In 1932, Milwaukee was home to another strange case. The butcher of Kingsbury run an unidentified serial killer who dismembered victims and left their remains in rivers. Investigators at the time debated whether society creates monsters or whether monsters just emerge from the shadows. That same question would come up again with Dahmer. Because as horrifying as the apartment discovery was, the bigger mystery was still unanswered. How did Jeffrey Dahmer become this? Was it childhood trauma, mental illness, or just evil in its rawest form? Investigators and psychologists are still debating whether Dahmer's crimes were fueled by compulsion, fantasy, or a cold calculation. For now, though, picture that moment: police radios crackling, neighbors gathering outside the apartment door taped off. Inside, a place that looked like any young man's bachelor pad had turned into a mausoleum. And as the headlines rolled out, Milwaukee Cannibal, House of Horrors, the entire world leaned in, asking the same question. Who was Jeffrey Dahmer really? Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was born on May 21st, 1960 in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but he didn't stay there for long. His parents, Lionel and Joyce, were educated, respectable. Lionel was a chemist, Joyce a homemaker with aspirations for more. On paper, it was an ordinary middle-class family. Behind closed doors, though, the cracks began to form early. When Jeffrey was still a toddler, Joyce struggled with depression and later anxiety. She often spent long stretches in bed, numbing herself with prescription medication. Lionel, buried in his PhD work, wasn't home much. That meant little Jeffrey was often left to his own imagination. Some neighbors remembered him as a quiet boy who wandered alone in the yard, poking at insects and small animals. And here's where the uneasy part comes in. By age 4, Dahmer had already shown a strange fascination with bones. He once recalled how his father, after cleaning animal remains from under the house, casually showed him how bones could be bleached. Lionel thought it was a father-son bonding moment. Jeffrey's eyes lit up in a way most kids wouldn't. That spark of curiosity never left him, it just twisted with age. Bath Township, Ohio became the family's home in 1968. The Dahmers moved into a large suburban house surrounded by woods and fields. It should have been idyllic. Jeffrey even had a younger brother, David, born in 1966. But inside, his parents fought bitterly arguments that could shake the walls. By his early teens, Jeffrey was a witness to chaos. His mother's mental health spiraled. His father grew angrier, more distant. In school, Jeffrey wasn't the class clown or the troublemaker. He was the invisible kid. Teachers described him as polite but emotionally flat. He developed a stutter, then turned to alcohol by ninth grade, sneaking beer into class, hidden in a styrofoam cup. Classmates even nicknamed him the guy with the cup. Yet there was something else. Jeffrey began bringing dead animals home, roadkill, squirrels, dogs. He dissected them in the woodshed behind the house. He called it a curiosity about how things worked. His friends, if you could call them that, shrugged it off as weird but harmless. One even joked, that's just Dahmer being Dahmer. But the fascination with what lay beneath the skin, with the line between life and death, was already cementing in his young mind. Here's an eerie historical parallel. In the early 20th century, Bath Township was also near Kent State University, where in 1970 the National Guard shot and killed 4 students during a protest. That event symbolized the collapse of trust between authority and youth. Similarly, in Dahmer's private world, trust between parent and child collapsed. He grew up in an environment where empathy seemed optional, where no one was looking too closely at what he was really becoming. One unusual detail that stands out: Dahmer kept a jar of tadpoles in his room, something plenty of boys do. But when he gave them to his teacher as a gift, his mother stormed into the school, angrily reclaiming them. She accused the teacher of trying to take something from her son. Investigators later debated whether this constant chaos at home, overprotective mother, emotionally absent father, nurtured the loneliness that fed Dahmer's obsessions. By high school graduation in 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer was isolated, heavy drinking daily, and simmering with fantasies he couldn't share. His parents had divorced. His mother moved out, taking his brother with her. Lionel remarried quickly and left the house. That summer, 18-year-old Jeffrey was alone in the family home with no supervision, no guidance, and plenty of alcohol. And then in June of that year, he crossed the line from curiosity into something irreversible. On a back road near his house, he picked up a hitchhiker named Stephen Hicks. What happened next was the start of his descent into history's darkest pages. Investigators and psychologists still debate whether Dahmer's monsterhood was born or made. Was it the parental neglect, the obsession with bones, or a destiny written in his DNA? Whatever the cause, by the time he turned 18, Jeffrey Dahmer was no longer just a lonely kid in Bath Township. He was on the verge of murder. The summer of 1978 was supposed to be Jeffrey Dahmer's fresh start. He had just graduated from Revere High School in Bath Township. Most of his classmates were preparing for college jobs or the freedom of adulthood. But Jeffrey was left behind in that empty family house, abandoned by a mother who had taken his brother and a father who had moved on with a new wife. It was Jeffrey alone with his bottles of beer, his spiraling fantasies, and no one watching. On June 18th, the loneliness broke. Dahmer was driving aimlessly when he spotted a hitchhiker, Stephen Hicks, 18 years old, long brown hair, guitar slung across his shoulder. Hicks was on his way to a rock concert. Jeffrey pulled over and offered him a ride. Hicks accepted, never knowing he had just stepped into the orbit of a killer. The two drove back to Dahmer's house. Jeffrey suggested they hang out, drink a few beers before the concert. Hicks, probably thinking it was harmless, agreed. They sat in the living room, cans piling up, small talk about music and school. But inside Dahmer, another conversation was taking place, one of desire, fear, and control. After hours, Hicks got restless. He said he needed to leave. That's when Dahmer panicked. The thought of being abandoned again, like his mother, like his father, triggered something violent. As Hicks stood up, Jeffrey grabbed a 10-pound dumbbell from behind a chair and smashed it against his skull. Hicks fell to the ground. Dahmer straddled him, pressing the bar against his throat until the struggling stopped. It was Jeffrey Dahmer's first murder, and it didn't happen in a fit of passion. It was calculated, almost cold. He later admitted, "I didn't want him to leave." What followed was the beginning of his macabre method. Dahmer dragged the body into a crawl space under the house. The smell of blood filled the basement. Within hours, he was dismembering Hicks, experimenting with how to strip flesh from bone. He smashed bones with a sledgehammer, scattering them in the backyard woods. Some remains were dissolved in acid. One unusual, unsettling detail: Dahmer collected the bones, bleached them, and later admitted he found them fascinating. Investigators still debate whether this act was about concealment or whether it gave him satisfaction, almost like creating a personal artifact. Here's a historical fact for context. In the late 1970s, Ohio had seen a rise in missing person cases tied to hitchhiking. Families and police debated whether the free ride culture of the decade had opened doors to predators. The state would later run campaigns warning teenagers against hitchhiking. Hicks's case, though, wasn't discovered in time to be part of that wave. It was swallowed into silence. For Jeffrey, the killing didn't spark regret. It sparked fascination. But in the strangest twist, he didn't kill again for nearly 9 years. Investigators and criminologists are still debating whether that cooling-off period was genuine self-control or simply the chaos of his life: college, the army, moving in with his grandmother, that temporarily distracted him from the urge. But the truth is this: after June 18, 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer knew he was capable of murder. He had crossed the threshold. And once a threshold like that is crossed, it's only a matter of time before the darkness demands more. After Stephen Hicks, Jeffrey Dahmer drifted in a haze of alcohol, secrecy, and an eerie kind of calm. He had taken a life, concealed it, and then nothing. For almost a year, he lived in that family home alone, numbing himself with beer cans and fantasies he didn't dare share. His father, Lionel, eventually noticed something was off. Jeffrey was wasting away aimless. Lionel, determined to push discipline into his troubled son, suggested the army. In December 1978, Jeffrey Dahmer enlisted in the United States Army, specifically training as a combat medic. On paper, it looked like a new chance, maybe even redemption. The Army had taken many young men in disarray and turned them into soldiers. For a while, it seemed like structure might give Dahmer's life shape. He was stationed in Baumholder, West Germany. His bunkmates later recalled him as quiet, polite at first, but then increasingly unstable when alcohol was in the mix. Jeffrey's drinking escalated to the point of chaos, sometimes putting away a case of beer by himself. In uniform on duty, his hands shook. He struggled to stay awake during drills. But here's where it takes a darker turn. While stationed in Germany, Dahmer was accused by fellow soldiers of sexual assault. 2 men later came forward saying he had drugged and raped them while they were incapacitated. At the time, the allegations weren't pursued. Records show Dahmer was disciplined for drinking, not for assault. The military, like many institutions back then, often swept such cases under the rug to protect its image. One unusual detail: the German police years later reopened files from the region, suspecting Dahmer could have been linked to unsolved murders of young men in the late 1970s. While no conclusive evidence tied him to those cases, investigators and detectives are still debating whether Dahmer's true first victims might not have been in Ohio at all, but overseas. The Army, however, discharged him in 1981 for alcohol abuse, granting him an honorable release despite his failings. And so, Jeffrey Dahmer returned to the United States, drifting without purpose. He briefly enrolled at Ohio State University, but flunked out within months. His father, frustrated and desperate, pushed him to live with his grandmother in West Allis, Wisconsin. Lionel believed grandma's devout Catholicism and nurturing presence could reform Jeffrey. For a while, the experiment worked, at least on the surface. Dahmer mowed the lawn, attended church, and ate dinner with her every night. But beneath that mask, the urges hadn't gone away. In fact, they were building. He began frequenting gay bars in Milwaukee, experimenting with encounters, but his fantasies were less about connection and more about control. Here's the historical anchor. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, Milwaukee's gay community was vibrant but marginalized. Police harassment was common, and crimes against gay men were often ignored. This environment gave predators like Dahmer more freedom. Victims could disappear without immediate alarms ringing. At Grandma's house, Dahmer began bringing men home, but she caught glimpses of troubling behavior. Strange odors from the garage. A mannequin in Jeffrey's room dressed and posed. Once she found a handgun under his bed. She scolded him, threw out the mannequin, but Jeffrey's secret life pressed on. For years after Hicks, Dahmer didn't kill again. But that silence wasn't mercy, it was a storm building. By 1987, the need to dominate, to possess, and eventually to kill had returned with a vengeance. Investigators later debated why it took so long. Was Dahmer truly suppressing his urges, or was he simply waiting for the right combination of opportunity and independence? Either way, when he finally struck again, it was in a hotel room in Milwaukee. That moment would break his nearly decade-long cooling-off period and unleash a spree that wouldn't stop until 1991. By the mid-1980s, Jeffrey Dahmer was living in his grandmother's house in West Allis, Wisconsin. To outsiders, it seemed like a second chance, a troubled young man under the guidance of a devout, loving woman. Grandma made him dinner, urged him to attend church, and hoped the routine would straighten him out. But beneath the surface, Dahmer's inner world was unraveling. He was working at a chocolate factory, clocking night shifts. His co-workers described him as quiet, odd, but harmless. At night, he slipped into Milwaukee's gay bars, drifting further into fantasies of control and possession. His obsessions weren't about companionship, they were about domination. He wanted partners who wouldn't leave, who wouldn't reject him, who wouldn't move. This is where he began experimenting. Dahmer started drugging men. He would slip sleeping pills into drinks, then take his unconscious companions back to his grandmother's house. Neighbors later recalled strange noises at night, the sound of heavy dragging, and an overwhelming odor Jeffrey explained away as taxidermy experiments. Here's an unusual detail: Dahmer actually did practice on dead animals, sometimes salvaging roadkill. He boiled the remains in chemicals, stripping flesh from bone. He told his father it was part of a biology interest. In truth, it was training. He was perfecting the process he would later use on human victims. But his behavior didn't go entirely unnoticed. In 1986, Dahmer was arrested for lewd and lascivious behavior after exposing himself to children at a park. He received a slap on the wrist, a suspended sentence. It was one of many chances authorities had to intervene more seriously. Then, in November 1987, the silence of his cooling-off period shattered. Dahmer met Stephen Twomey, a 25-year-old man, at a Milwaukee gay bar. They checked into a hotel room together. Jeffrey later claimed he only wanted Twomey to stay the night to keep him close, but after hours of drinking, he blacked out. When he woke the next morning, Twomey was dead. His chest was bruised, his body limp. Dahmer claimed he had no memory of killing him, only the horrifying realization of what he'd done. And yet, instead of panicking, he acted. He purchased a large suitcase, stuffed Twomey's body inside, and called a taxi. The driver helped load the heavy bag, having no idea what was inside. At his grandmother's house, Dahmer dragged the suitcase into the basement. Over the next days, he dismembered the body, boiled flesh away, and pulverized bones with a hammer. Twomey was gone, completely erased. It was a turning point. This wasn't just about compulsion. It was about power, secrecy, and the knowledge that he could kill, conceal, and move on without consequence. Dahmer later admitted Twomey's death awakened something he couldn't put back to sleep. Here's the chilling context. Milwaukee police records from the time show missing person cases, especially among gay men, were often dismissed as runaways or lifestyle choices. Twomey's disappearance didn't trigger a manhunt. His name simply faded from the files. Investigators and criminologists later debated this moment. Some believe Dahmer's blackout story was true, that Twomey's death was accidental. Others argue it was the first time Dahmer acted fully on his homicidal fantasy. Regardless, it set the stage for what would follow, a series of murders, each more deliberate, each more ritualized. From that night on, Dahmer was no longer just a troubled man with dark fantasies. He was a predator, and Milwaukee would become his hunting ground. Word count 1,729, waiting for continued. Do you want me to continue with part 6? The escalation patterns of luring, drugging, killing, and the growing police blind spots of the late 1980s, part 6. The year was 1988, and Jeffrey Dahmer's life seemed to oscillate between dull routine and explosive violence. By day, he worked at the Ambrosia chocolate factory, clocking his shifts quietly among coworkers who found him strange but unremarkable. By night, he haunted Milwaukee's gay bars and bathhouses looking for his next victim. Unlike the chaotic aftermath of Stephen Twomey's death, Dahmer's killings began to follow a pattern. He would lure men with the promise of drinks money or photographs. He carried with him a small arsenal of sleeping pills crushed and dissolved in liquor. Once incapacitated, his victims lost all autonomy. They became, in his mind, possessions. One of the strangest details in this phase of Dahmer's life is how methodical he became. He bought a large blue plastic drum, filled it with chemicals, and stored it in his grandmother's basement. He was experimenting, learning what combinations could reduce a body to sludge, what processes preserved bones. To his grandmother, the odors creeping up from the basement were unbearable. She scolded him, pleaded with him to move out. Dahmer excused the smells as a byproduct of his meat storage or hobby taxidermy. In September 1988, Dahmer's behavior crossed a legal threshold. He lured a 13-year-old boy into his home and drugged him. The boy escaped and told his family. Dahmer was arrested and charged with sexual exploitation of a minor. Finally, it seemed like accountability had arrived, but here's where institutional failure entered the story. The court sentenced Dahmer to 5 years probation and 1 year in a correctional work release program. He was required to register as a sex offender, but was not sent to prison long term, a decision that in hindsight would have deadly consequences. During this period, Dahmer continued his experiments in secret. He admitted later that prison didn't deter him, it only made him more cautious. When released in 1990, he moved into the Oxford apartments in Milwaukee. Apartment 213 would become the epicenter of his crimes. The Oxford apartments were a low-rent complex in a struggling neighborhood. Tenants included immigrants' families and the working poor. Dahmer fit in as a quiet, somewhat awkward bachelor. He decorated his unit with blackout curtains, a fish tank of tropical fish, and hidden from view skulls, bones, and preserved body parts. Neighbors began to notice. Strange smells seeped through the vents. Some heard the sound of a power saw at odd hours. One neighbor later recalled a particularly disturbing detail. Dahmer once offered her a sandwich wrapped in foil. She declined, uneasy. Later, she wondered if the meat inside was human. Dahmer's obsession with control escalated. He wasn't content with killing, he wanted to create what he called living zombies. Victims were drugged, then subjected to crude experiments, drilling holes into their skulls and injecting acid or boiling water into the brain. The goal was to destroy free will while leaving the body alive. None of the victims survived. Between 1990 and 1991, Dahmer killed at a staggering pace. He photographed his victims in staged, intimate poses, kept body parts as trophies, and stacked skulls like a macabre collection. His apartment reeked of rot, but police visits triggered by neighbors' complaints were dismissed with Jeffrey's explanations about spoiled food or tropical fish tanks. Here's a legitimate historical fact. In May 1991, 14-year-old Konorak Synthesomphone, the younger brother of the boy Dahmer had previously assaulted, actually escaped Dahmer's apartment. Neighbors called police after finding the boy drugged, bleeding, and incoherent in the street. But when officers arrived, Dahmer calmly explained it was a lover's quarrel. Despite neighbors' protests, the boy was returned to Dahmer's custody. Within an hour, Konorak was dead. This moment remains one of the most shocking failures in modern policing. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether bias against the neighborhood's largely black and immigrant population and against the gay community played a role in the officers' failure to intervene. By summer 1991, Dahmer's apartment was filled with human remains, skulls in a closet, torsos in a freezer, a 57-gallon drum of dissolving bodies in the bedroom. He had escalated beyond secrecy. His crimes were now barely concealed beneath the thin veneer of his quiet loner persona. The stage was set for his downfall, and it would arrive not because of police vigilance, but because one victim survived. On the night of July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's cycle of murder and concealment finally broke apart. He left his apartment at the Oxford complex, scanning the streets of Milwaukee for his next victim. His gaze fell on a group of 3 men, Tracy Edwards, along with 2 friends. Dahmer approached with his usual soft-spoken pitch. He offered them $100 to come back to his place for drinks and to pose for some photographs. 2 declined. Tracy, restless and needing money, hesitated, but ultimately agreed. As they walked to Dahmer's apartment, Tracy noticed Jeffrey's strange mannerisms, quiet, almost nervous, but nothing that screamed danger. Still, when the door to apartment 213 opened, a wave of odor hit him. It was a smell Tracy would later describe in court as foul, like rotten meat. Dahmer mumbled something about plumbing problems. Inside, the place was dim. Blackout curtains sealed the windows. A blue barrel sat in the corner, sealed shut. On the walls were photographs, fish tanks bubbling in eerie silence. Dahmer handed Tracy a drink, urging him to relax. Then things shifted. Dahmer tried to place handcuffs on Tracy. He managed to snap one cuff on his wrist before Tracy pulled away. Dahmer, keeping his composure, brandished a knife and said softly, "You're going to do as I say." For hours, Tracy was trapped. He tried to keep Dahmer calm, chatting about random things, hoping to build rapport. He noticed chilling details: a foul-smelling refrigerator, a closet filled with jars, and the strange, absent look in Dahmer's eyes. Finally, when Dahmer's attention wavered, Tracy made his move. He asked to use the bathroom. When Dahmer glanced toward the TV, Tracy bolted, running out of the apartment down the street, with the handcuff still dangling from his wrist. He flagged down 2 police officers. Here's the strange twist of fate. These officers, Robert Routh and Rolf Muller, were not initially convinced. They thought Tracy's story sounded like a domestic dispute, but Tracy insisted. He led them back to apartment 213. Dahmer greeted them calmly, smiling, even agreeing to let them search. He thought he could bluff his way through, as he had so many times before. But Officer Muller, poking around the bedroom, opened a bedside drawer. Inside was a stack of Polaroids, dozens of photographs of men in various stages of dismemberment. Some were posed before death, others after. They were gruesome trophies, documented meticulously. Muller froze. He called out to his partner, "These are real." When Dahmer realized the discovery, he tried to fight. He lunged at the officers, but it was too late. They subdued him, cuffed him, and called for backup. The search that followed revealed horrors that stunned the world. The refrigerator contained a severed human head. A freezer held wrapped packages of flesh. Skulls lined the closet. The blue barrel contained torsos dissolving in acid. In total, police recovered remains of 11 different victims within the apartment. Here's a legitimate historical fact: the evidence catalog filled over 80 cardboard boxes. Milwaukee police had never seen anything like it. News of Dahmer's arrest spread like wildfire. Crowds gathered outside the Oxford apartments, shouting, some even chanting, "Burn it down." Families of missing men began to call police, wondering if their loved ones had been among the remains. Investigators and detectives are still debating whether Dahmer's apartment revealed the full scope of his crimes. He confessed to 17 murders, but some suspect the real number could be higher. His meticulous dismemberments left many victims impossible to identify. For Milwaukee, the discovery was more than just a criminal case, it was a cultural earthquake. People asked how someone could commit such atrocities for years, while neighbors complained victims escaped, and police dismissed the warnings. The failures were impossible to ignore. The Milwaukee Cannibal, as he came to be known, had finally been stopped. But the scars left behind in the community, in the victims' families, and in the national psyche were only beginning to form. After Jeffrey Dahmer's arrest on July 22, 1991, investigators transported him to Milwaukee Police Headquarters. They expected resistance, denials, maybe silence. Instead, Dahmer stunned them. He spoke with an eerie calm, as though unburdening himself after years of carrying secrets too heavy to bear. Detective Patrick Kennedy, who led much of the interrogation, later described Dahmer as polite, cooperative, almost relieved. The killer didn't ask for a lawyer immediately. Instead, he leaned forward and told detectives, "I'll tell you everything. I have to get this off my chest." And he did. For hours, then days, Dahmer laid out the full scale of his crimes in shocking detail. He described how he lured men to his home with promises of money or drinks, how he drugged them, strangled them, and then dismembered their bodies. He admitted to necrophilia, to photographing his victims, and to keeping body parts as trophies. One of the strangest and most unsettling confessions was his zombie experiment. Dahmer explained how he drilled holes in the skulls of drugged victims and injected acid or boiling water into their brains. His goal, he said, was to create a permanent state of submission. He wanted companions who would never leave him living, but devoid of will. None survived these crude, nightmarish procedures. He also confessed to cannibalism. He described frying pieces of flesh, storing organs in his freezer, even attempting to preserve hearts and muscles in formaldehyde. To Dahmer, consuming his victims was a way of making them a permanent part of me. Detectives were horrified but methodical. They compared his words against the evidence seized from apartment 213. The Polaroids matched the bodies, the freezer packages matched his descriptions, and the skulls were arranged exactly as he said. His memory was disturbingly precise down to the dates and locations where he had met each victim. Here's a legitimate historical fact. Dahmer confessed to murdering 17 men between 1978 and 1991. Investigators were able to identify most of the victims, but some remains were too fragmented to conclusively match. Among his confessions, he revealed an overlooked piece of his past, his very first murder in 1978, when he killed hitchhiker Stephen Hicks at his parents' home in Ohio. He dismembered Hicks, smashed his bones with a sledgehammer, and scattered them in the woods behind the house. For over a decade, no one connected him to it. For detectives, the sheer openness was unsettling. Here was a man who calmly described horrors most people couldn't imagine without a hint of visible emotion. He wasn't bragging exactly. He wasn't remorseful either. It was as though he had stepped out of a trance and was now simply narrating what he had done. When asked why, Dahmer explained, "I didn't want them to leave. I wanted to keep them with me. It was less about rage or hatred and more about loneliness twisted into something monstrous." Investigators and criminologists are still debating whether Dahmer's cooperation was genuine remorse or simply a narcissistic need to control the narrative. Some argue he wanted notoriety to be remembered. Others say he was too exhausted to continue lying and found a strange relief in confession. One strange detail: despite the grotesque admissions, Dahmer occasionally slipped into small talk with detectives. He complimented their ties, asked about their families, even worried about whether his fish at the apartment were still alive. These bizarre asides chilled investigators more than the confessions themselves. As transcripts piled up, it became clear this case wasn't just another homicide investigation. It was the unmasking of one of America's most prolific and disturbing serial killers. And yet, what unsettled the public most was not only the crimes, but the quiet, almost gentle way in which Jeffrey Dahmer told his story. When Jeffrey Dahmer's case finally reached the courtroom in January 1992, the world was watching. The Milwaukee County Courthouse was surrounded by reporters, victims' families, and curious citizens, desperate to see the man who had become known as the Milwaukee Cannibal. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. The prosecution had 15 counts of murder on the table, each carrying the possibility of life imprisonment. Dahmer had confessed to 17 murders in total, but prosecutors focused on the 15 they could prove most clearly with physical evidence and his own testimony. The courtroom revealed the dual nature of Dahmer's public image. On one hand, he was soft-spoken, polite, almost boyish in appearance. On the other, the evidence presented against him was stomach-churning. Polaroids of mutilated bodies, skulls lined up in his closet freezers filled with human remains. Dahmer's defense strategy hinged on one point: insanity. His lawyers argued that no sane man could commit such grotesque acts of murder, dismemberment, and cannibalism. They painted a picture of a deeply disturbed individual plagued by uncontrollable urges and hallucinations disconnected from reality. The prosecution countered with equal force. They argued Dahmer was calculating, organized, and deliberate. He purchased chemicals, preserved trophies, and lured his victims with premeditated methods. These were not the actions of a man disconnected from reality. They were the actions of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and chose to do it anyway. Here's a legitimate historical fact: the trial lasted about 3 weeks with testimony from experts, investigators, and even Dahmer himself. One of the most debated moments came when forensic psychiatrist Dr. Park Dietz testified for the prosecution. He acknowledged Dahmer's behavior was abnormal and grotesque, but emphasized that he was legally sane. He knew his acts were wrong, Dietz stated, pointing to Dahmer's elaborate attempts to hide his crimes and avoid detection. Throughout the trial, Dahmer's demeanor unsettled spectators. He sat quietly, often with his head down, sometimes listening intently, sometimes staring blankly. Victims' families seated in the gallery wept openly. Some shouted at him. At one point, a mother of a victim screamed, "You devil," and had to be escorted out of the courtroom. One strange and unusual detail emerged during testimony. Dahmer admitted he often watched The Exorcist, The Three, before or after his murders. He identified with a character in the film who spoke about possessing others' souls. This odd fixation further blurred the line between his twisted fantasies and reality. The jury deliberated for just over 5 hours. Their verdict: Jeffrey Dahmer was sane at the time of the murders. He was found guilty on all 15 counts of murder. The judge sentenced him to 15 consecutive life sentences, ensuring he would never be released. Later, Dahmer would receive a 16th life sentence for the murder of his first victim, Stephen Hicks, tried in Ohio. As the sentence was read, Dahmer remained stoic. No tears, no visible relief, no outbursts. For many, that silence was as haunting as the crimes themselves. Investigators and legal scholars are still debating whether the insanity defense could ever have succeeded. Was Dahmer truly incapable of controlling his compulsions, or was he simply evil in the most methodical sense? The trial cemented one truth: Jeffrey Dahmer would spend the rest of his life behind bars. But for the families of his victims, the courtroom offered only partial closure. The images of what their loved ones endured could never be erased, and Milwaukee itself would carry the stigma of Dahmer's crimes for decades. Jeffrey Dahmer entered prison in 1992, sentenced to life after life, effectively condemned to spend every remaining day behind bars. He was housed at the Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, a maximum security facility filled with hardened criminals, many of whom knew exactly who he was before he arrived. To the public, Dahmer was a monster. But inside prison, he was something stranger, a curiosity, an object of both fascination and hatred. Some inmates wanted to talk to him to understand the why. Others wanted to hurt him, disgusted by the details of his crimes. Prison guards kept him under close watch, especially after threats began to circulate. At first, Dahmer's days followed a rigid routine. He worked in the prison library, helped with janitorial tasks, and spent long hours in his cell reading the Bible and other books. A chaplain visited him regularly. Dahmer claimed he was seeking forgiveness, even baptism. To some, it looked like a sincere conversion. To others, it seemed like a performance, a final way of controlling how people saw him. Here's a legitimate historical fact: Dahmer was baptized in May 1994 by prison minister Roy Ratcliffe in the prison whirlpool. Oddly, on the same day, serial killer John Wayne Gacy was executed in Illinois. One unusual detail emerged from this period: Dahmer developed a dark sense of humor about his own crimes. In the prison cafeteria, he reportedly shaped his food into body parts, smeared ketchup like blood, and told guards he was just having fun. These macabre jokes infuriated both staff and inmates. To many, it showed that his remorse was shallow at best. Yet prison life also brought out something else: vulnerability. Dahmer was not a large man, nor physically intimidating. His notoriety put a target on his back. Guards admitted later that keeping him safe was nearly impossible. Still, Dahmer seemed oddly at peace in confinement. He told interviewers that prison stripped away temptation. "It's good I'm here," he said. "I deserve it." He claimed he finally felt free of his compulsions, free of the cycle of killing and hiding. For the first time, he no longer had to maintain the facade of normal life while harboring dark urges. But even in prison, the debate about his true nature continued. Was this calm demeanor evidence of genuine repentance? Or was it simply another mask worn for convenience? Investigators and criminologists are still debating whether Dahmer's talk of redemption reflected sincerity or manipulation. As months turned into years, resentment among other inmates grew. Some viewed Dahmer as a celebrity killer, receiving too much attention from the outside world. Others simply couldn't stomach the idea of living alongside a man who had done such things. In this crucible of violence, Jeffrey Dahmer's fate was sealed not by the justice system, but by prison politics. By late 1994, the tension inside Columbia Correctional Institution had reached a breaking point. Jeffrey Dahmer had become both infamous and isolated. Guards tried to keep him separate from inmates who might target him, but that was an impossible task in a crowded prison where resentment ran deep. On the morning of November 28, 1994, Dahmer was assigned to a routine cleaning detail in a prison bathroom and gym area. With him were two other inmates: Jesse Anderson, serving time for murdering his wife, and Christopher Scarver, a man convicted of a separate killing who was known for his unpredictable, sometimes violent behavior. The guards left them unsupervised for a short period, just 20 minutes. It was all the time Scarver needed. Scarver later explained that he had grown disgusted with Dahmer's presence. He claimed Dahmer mocked other inmates by shaping food into fake body parts, taunting them with references to his crimes. He crossed the line with me, Scarver would later tell reporters. Armed with a metal bar taken from exercise equipment, Scarver attacked. The blows came fast and brutal. Dahmer was struck in the head and face repeatedly. Anderson, too, was targeted. When guards returned, they found Dahmer bleeding on the floor, barely alive. He was rushed to a nearby hospital, but within an hour, he was pronounced dead at the age of 34. Here's a legitimate historical fact. Dahmer's autopsy revealed severe skull and brain trauma. He never regained consciousness after the attack. The prison system faced immediate scrutiny. How could one of America's most notorious killers be left unsupervised in close quarters with other violent inmates? Officials insisted it was a lapse, a rare accident. Critics saw it as inevitable. Dahmer was marked from the moment he entered prison. Scarver later stated that he believed God had chosen him as an instrument of justice. Some inmates even praised him for killing Dahmer, calling it revenge for the victims. Others questioned whether Scarver's mental illness and religious delusions clouded his judgment. Investigators and criminologists are still debating whether Dahmer's murder was premeditated or simply the explosion of prison tensions. Dahmer's family received his remains quietly. Unlike many killers who leave behind monuments of infamy, Dahmer left little. The Oxford apartments where his horrors took place were demolished in 1992, reduced to an empty lot. His possessions, furniture, tools, and personal items were purchased by a civic group and destroyed, burned, to prevent them from ever becoming morbid souvenirs. One unusual detail: Dahmer's brain became the subject of a bitter family dispute. His father wanted it cremated, but his mother insisted it be studied by scientists to understand what had caused his behavior. After legal wrangling, a court ordered the brain destroyed. It was cremated in 1995, ending the debate. In death, Dahmer remained as polarizing as in life. To some, his killing in prison was justice served. To others, it was a failure of the state to uphold its responsibility. Even monsters, they argued, deserve due process and protection behind bars. What is certain is this: Jeffrey Dahmer's death did not erase his crimes. It left behind a trail of grief, unanswered questions, and a dark legacy that still casts its shadow over Milwaukee and the world of true crime. The death of Jeffrey Dahmer in November 1994 did not bring closure. It only opened a new chapter of grief, reflection, and reckoning. For the families of the 17 young men and boys Dahmer had murdered, his violent end was bittersweet. Some openly expressed relief, even gratitude that he would never again draw breath. Others felt cheated. They had wanted him to serve his full sentence, to live day after day with the weight of his crimes, instead of being granted what they saw as an easy exit. Milwaukee itself was left scarred. The city, once known primarily for breweries and working-class neighborhoods, became forever associated with the word cannibal. The Oxford apartments where most of Dahmer's murders had taken place were demolished in 1992, 2 years before his death, after neighbors protested that the building had become a grotesque tourist attraction. Today, the lot remains empty, a silent reminder of horrors too great to rebuild upon. Investigators, criminologists, and lawmakers began a painful post-mortem, not just of Dahmer's life, but of the failures that had allowed his killing spree to continue unchecked for so long. One glaring example was the case of Konorak Synthesomphone, the 14-year-old boy who escaped Dahmer's apartment in 1991. Neighbors found him disoriented and called police. But when officers arrived, Dahmer convinced them that Konorak was his adult lover in a drunken dispute. The police left the boy with Dahmer, who killed him shortly after. That single failure, among others, fueled outrage and accusations of systemic racism and homophobia. In response, law enforcement agencies across the U.S. reviewed policies on missing persons, especially involving LGBTQ youth and minorities. Training was expanded, emphasizing the dangers of dismissing such cases as runaways. While changes came too late for Dahmer's victims, they reshaped how police departments approached similar investigations. Here's a legitimate historical fact. In 1991, after Dahmer's arrest, the Milwaukee Police Department faced lawsuits from victims' families. Eventually, the city settled for nearly $900,000 to be divided among the families of Dahmer's victims. One unusual detail from the aftermath is that victims' families debated what to do with Dahmer's estate. While he had little of value, proceeds from interviews, book rights, and public interest in the case became contentious. Many families fought to claim damages, arguing that any money connected to Dahmer should belong to those he had harmed. The cultural impact was just as profound. Dahmer's case became the subject of countless documentaries, films, and books, not because people wanted to glorify him, but because the sheer scale of his crimes forced society to confront uncomfortable truths. He was not a monster in the shadows. He was someone who blended into neighborhoods, joked with neighbors, attended family dinners. He looked ordinary. That was the true terror. Dahmer's story has since been dissected through many lenses: psychology, criminology, sociology. Was he born this way or shaped by childhood trauma? Was his compulsion a mental illness or simply evil? Investigators and criminologists are still debating where the line lies between sickness and monstrosity. For the families, however, such questions mattered little. Their sons, brothers, and friends were gone. Their names, often overshadowed by Dahmer's, remained the truest legacy of this tragedy. And in Milwaukee, candles are still lit, plaques are still laid, and prayers are still whispered for those lost to a man whose crimes forever changed how America understands the face of evil. The years following Jeffrey Dahmer's death were filled with both silence and noise. Silence because the man himself was gone. No more interviews, no more court hearings, no more presence in the headlines as a living reminder. But noise because his crimes echoed endlessly in documentaries, books, podcasts, classrooms, and living rooms across the world. In Milwaukee, the community struggled with how to live under the shadow of what had happened. Some wanted to erase it completely, bulldoze the Oxford apartments, close the files, never speak his name again. Others argued that forgetting would mean failing to learn. They wanted reminders, a museum, an archive, or at least a public memorial for the victims. But even that sparked debate. Should a city forever stamp itself with the face of horror, or should it only honor the lives lost quietly without giving Dahmer himself any further notoriety? Here's a legitimate historical fact. In 2012, over 20 years after Dahmer's arrest, the City Council of Milwaukee formally blocked the creation of any Dahmer-themed attractions. There were proposals from outsiders to turn the lot into a tourist site, but the council voted unanimously against it. The lot remains empty to this day. One unusual detail came when his brain became the center of controversy. After his death, Dahmer's mother wanted his brain studied by scientists to understand what might have driven his crimes. His father wanted him cremated without delay. In the end, a judge ordered the brain destroyed. That decision still sparks academic debates over whether knowledge was lost forever or whether preserving it would have been an invasion of privacy and dignity. Psychologists and criminologists dissected Dahmer's case for decades. Some argued his actions reflected necrophilia and cannibalistic compulsions rooted in abandonment and isolation. Others insisted those explanations fell short, that he represented the darkest edge of human nature, impossible to rationalize with science. Investigators and psychologists are still debating whether Dahmer's killings were the result of mental illness or whether he simply chose to surrender to urges most people suppress. For the families, the academic discussions meant little. They held vigils, set up scholarships in victims' names, and spoke at conferences about the need for better policing and stronger community support. Their grief became activism. The cultural resonance of the case went beyond Milwaukee. Across the world, Dahmer became a symbol of evil cloaked in normalcy. He wasn't the shadowy figure in a dark alley. He was the guy next door with a polite smile. That realization forced people to reconsider how they view monsters. They are not always separate from society, they are sometimes created by it, and they can hide in plain sight. Documentaries continue to surface, each claiming to shed new light on his life and crimes. Some focus on the failures of police. Others explore his upbringing. Still others frame the victims' stories, giving names and faces back to those erased by Dahmer's violence. Each retelling shapes how new generations understand not just the case, but the fragile boundaries of human morality. And yet there remains a haunting sense that no story, no documentary, no court case could ever fully answer the central question: why? Why did one man feel compelled to commit such horrific acts, and could it have been prevented if the warning signs had been caught sooner? the tragedy of Jeffrey Dahmer is not just in the lives he took. It is in the way society failed to see, failed to listen, and failed to act until it was too late. And that perhaps is the lesson that lingers most sharply. Evil thrives in silence, in neglect, and in disbelief. As we near the end of this story, it is worth pausing to remember that the victims were more than names in a file. They were sons, brothers, friends, and lovers. They laughed, dreamed, and lived. Their voices deserve to be louder than the shadow of the man who silenced them. The last emotional arc before the soft ending in part 15. When the story of Jeffrey Dahmer is told, it often feels like a never-ending echo chamber of shock, horror, and fascination. But beneath the headlines and documentaries, there lies a quieter, deeper current, a reckoning with how fragile safety really is, and how often the signs of danger slip by unnoticed. For Milwaukee, the case left scars that reshaped the city's identity. Parents raised their children with sharper caution. The LGBTQ community, which had already faced prejudice and police neglect, carried the heavy truth that many of Dahmer's victims were young gay men of color ignored because of who they were. That reality could not be swept aside, and slowly from grief and anger came change. Here's a historical fact worth remembering. In 1991, after Dahmer's arrest, Milwaukee's police department underwent one of the most scrutinized reviews in U.S. history. Training programs were rebuilt. Sensitivity training for LGBTQ+ issues was mandated, and nationally discussions about missing persons, especially young men, shifted. The legacy of those reforms rippled outward. One unusual detail in the years after Dahmer's death is that his story began to appear in unexpected places: pop culture, Halloween costumes, even dark humor memes. Families of the victims fought against this trivialization, reminding the public that their pain was not entertainment. And yet society's strange pull toward the macabre could not be stopped. The debate continues: why are people so fascinated with men like Dahmer? Some argue it's because we want to understand the why to find logic in chaos. Others say it's because true crime stories allow us to confront our deepest fears safely from the comfort of our couches. Investigators and psychologists are still debating whether media attention helps society learn from these horrors, or whether it fuels a cycle of glamorizing evil. For the victims' families, each retelling is both a wound and a candle. A wound because it reopens grief. A candle because it ensures their sons are not forgotten. That balance is fragile, and it explains why memorial services still draw quiet crowds, even decades later. There is something chilling about how ordinary Dahmer seemed to those around him. He worked at a chocolate factory. He greeted neighbors with a smile. He was even known to offer people sandwiches, at times sandwiches that some now shudder to think about. That uncanny ordinariness is perhaps the greatest horror of all. Monsters do not always wear masks. Sometimes they wear faces that blend seamlessly into everyday life. As we near the end of this narrative, it is clear that Dahmer's crimes were more than a series of murders. They became a mirror reflecting not only one man's twisted compulsions, but also the failures, prejudices, and blind spots of a society that let him kill for 13 years. The lesson is stark: evil does not always knock loudly. Sometimes it whispers from behind closed doors. And when we fail to listen, tragedy becomes inevitable. The story of Jeffrey Dahmer is one of those dark chapters that refuses to close no matter how many times it's retold. His death in 1994 ended his life, but it did not end the questions, the fascination, or the grief. Tonight, as we step back from the cold corridors of his apartment, from the yellowing police files, from the courtroom transcripts, we find ourselves left with a simple but devastating truth: the victims mattered most. Their lives, cut short, were filled with hope, humor, and love. They were sons, brothers, friends, and partners. They were more than names on a list, more than footnotes in a horror story. Milwaukee carries their memory quietly in vigils, in the absence left on family dinner tables and the prayers whispered at church pews. And perhaps that is the most powerful part of this tragedy. Even after decades, their memory burns brighter than the shadow of the man who took them. Here's one last historical fact. The lot where the Oxford Apartments once stood remains empty, grass growing where brick and mortar used to be. It has never been rebuilt. For many, that emptiness is symbolic, a scar on the city, but also a space of silence where the past is both remembered and refused a new life. An unusual detail that lingers in the collective imagination is how ordinary Dahmer looked in photographs, quiet, bespectacled, almost shy. That ordinariness unsettles us because it blurs the line between neighbor and killer, between safety and danger. It reminds us how fragile trust can be, and the debate continues even now. Investigators, criminologists, and psychologists are still debating whether Dahmer's story teaches us more about the darkness inside one man or about the cracks in society that allowed him to keep killing. Maybe it's both. Maybe it always will be. So before we close tonight, take one last look at the story not as a tale of a monster, but as a reminder of resilience. Communities can change, systems can be reformed, and families, though broken, can find ways to carry memory forward. Now turn off the lights, lie back on your comfy cushions, and let the weight of this story drift into silence. Evil had its day, but memory belongs to the lost. What if I told you that Dahmer's case wasn't the only one that left behind questions we can't shake? That just as Milwaukee struggled with its shadows, other cities, New York, Los Angeles, even small towns tucked between mountains carry their own unresolved stories. Next time, we'll step into another tale where the surface looks calm, but underneath something deeply unsettling waits. We'll walk through empty streets at midnight, follow faint clues left behind in dust, and ask questions that don't always have easy answers. Some mysteries end with a confession, some with a trial. Others end with silence and a door that never opens again. But in every one, there's a human heartbeat at the center, fragile and fleeting. So if tonight's journey has kept you awake, if you've felt that mix of dread, sadness, and curiosity, don't worry, you're not alone. That's what we do here. We sit together in the dark, we face the shadows, and we remember that the line between comfort and fear is thinner than we think. And maybe, just maybe, the next story we uncover will show us not only the darkness, but the glimmer of truth that hides inside it.